welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed your first workshop session and lunch. The format for this afternoon is to shift from the personal stories you heard this morning towards a more, I suppose, analytical or evidence-based approach. We're focusing particularly in this afternoon's session on women in the workplace, but we acknowledge that leadership happens in all sorts of places in our communities, in the home, in community organisations, in the school and the like. We've asked this panel of experts to focus on some very particular questions, which I'm going to ask each of them. We know from the clear evidence that discrimination against women in the workforce continues in many dimensions of their participation. We also know that intersectional discrimination, particularly discrimination on the basis of race, which we heard about this morning, but on the basis of sexual orientation, on the basis of disability and many other factors, are an additional barrier for many women. So we've got together a panel of true experts coming from a range of different perspectives, private sector, public sector, community sector, to share their observations and reflections. We're hoping, as well as identifying obstacles and barriers, that we're going to be able to provide some ideas about solutions and be creative and imaginative around the issues that we're talking about. So let me turn to our four panellists. The first, Caroline Lambert, has been a women's rights activist for as long as I've known her, which is now coming close to 25 years, I think. Caroline is the CEO or Executive Director of the YWCA of Australia. She's had a long-standing interest and expertise on issues ranging from human rights to homelessness. She's been a leader of many Australian delegations in the international sphere at the United Nations with the Commission on the Status of Women, and she will share with you some of her perspective, hopefully some opinions that might not be shared with others on the panel, so that we can get a bit of dialogue and debate going. Our second contributor is Helen Conway. You'll know her as the Director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which is charged at the Australian government level with identifying and documenting the government's efforts to improve gender equality in the workplace. I have a particular interest in some of the work she's been doing because very recently the legal profession released the results of some data collection and survey work which demonstrated that, surprise, surprise, the legal profession has many leaps and bounds to take before we achieve gender equality, particularly my part of the profession, the bar, which is quite antediluvian in its practices. Our third speaker is Carmel McGregor. She is a Deputy Secretary in the Department of Defence with a lovely title, People, Strategies and Policy. She's been there since March 2012 after a career in the public service from areas as diverse as immigration and citizenship through to disability, employment and education. So we're looking forward to the perspective that she'll bring to the discussion. And our final panellist this afternoon is Yolanda. Yolanda Vega is the CEO of Australian Women Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She has a history in Australia, starting with an arrival from Madrid to Darwin, and tells a glorious story of her mother not being able to find a matching handbag and shoes in Darwin of the early 1970s. Prior to her involvement with the Chamber of Commerce, Yolanda worked as an entrepreneur. I think she was trying to make money out of peace, which I applaud as an initiative, but I don't know that she can affirm that there's yet as much money to be made in peace as there is in war. But nonetheless, she's working with a number of ministers at the federal level to talk about and promote the value add of women in women-owned firms to the economy. So our intention this afternoon is to throw a question specifically to each of our panellists, and I'll ask each of them to address their question in turn. But if any of you want to add, disagree, affirm something that's been said, please feel free to do so as we work through our agenda. And of course, we're looking forward to questions from the floor and questions that might come in via Twitter. So, Caroline, first to you. The barriers for participation, to participation of women in leadership aren't new. We've known about them and recorded them and documented them, and we've had several decades of action to address them. The stats don't show enormous progress in leadership roles, and I'm wondering if you can comment on why we haven't seen greater improvement in leadership and what you see are the bright spots, and I suppose what strategies you think have worked best and will work best going forward. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks, Susan. I just wanted to acknowledge at the outset that we're meeting on lands of traditional owners today, and to pay my respect to elders past and present. And in that context, to acknowledge that Nova Peris Kneebone was elected the first Indigenous woman in Parliament last year. And it's extraordinary that we're still having these firsts around leadership, but really fantastic to celebrate Nova's election into the Parliament. The very first woman was elected into an Australian Parliament in 1921. We were given the right to stand for a vote as candidates in 1903, and we were given the right to vote for the first time in South Australia in 1895, extended to Indigenous women in 1962. So that's a pretty long gap. But I did want to reflect, this is a long game, right? This continent, this land that we're sitting on, has been inhabited for 40,000 years. I work for the YWCA, which internationally grounds a lot of its work in the Bible, and that document was written variously, 2000 to, well, actually there's decades and centuries between some of the books in the Bible, largely written by a bunch of blokes. And it's a long game, undoing all of those, years and decades and centuries and millennia of patriarchy. Is a long game. So the fact that, in 1903 we were told that we could stand as candidates, and we're still, to be honest, not all that flash in the parliamentary sense. Since 2001 we've sat roughly at kind of 37 to 40 women in Parliament, with roughly 110 to 113 blokes in Parliament at the same time. That's in the House of Representatives. So clearly the statistics, as Susan alluded to, are telling us that we're still not there yet. And I think when you look more broadly, the YWCA, in partnership with ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Service, and Women on Boards, did a survey 2 years ago into community sector leadership. And what we found in a sector which is predominantly staffed by women is that women indeed do hold a greater percentage of leadership positions. But there was a really fascinating and somewhat depressing cut of the data. When you started to look at organisations with turnovers, higher financial turnovers, you got more men involved, and you started to lose the gender parity which we had seen in the smaller organisations. Indeed, the organisations that existed entirely on government funding and with a high level of volunteer labour were far more likely to have an all-female board than an organisation which had a turnover of over $500,000, which was far more likely to have men as the dominant percentage on the board. So, if you dwelt in the land of statistics, you'd be forever depressed. So what we have done, and one of the things I've been really proud of at the YWCA, is asking ourselves some questions around, 1, do we need quotas? 2, what can we do to change the cultural constructs of leadership? And 3, what can we do then to change and transform the programs? So when we talk about the cultural construct of leadership, it's possible I'm having a jargon moment. But really, if you think back to the type of experiences that Prime Minister Gillard had, part of that was because if you close your eyes, we've been conditioned to think of a bloke as a leader. And it really goes back to a very, very long time ago. Our notions of leadership, this idea that you lead from the front and that you've got to know exactly where you're going and that you can't have any chance of vulnerability or hesitation or even the belief that collectively, collaboratively, our brains might actually come up with a better answer than just my brain by myself. Our notions of leadership, for the most part, are still stuck on a battlefield with a king on a horse, first of all surveying from the background, from the back of the field, the battlefield, to work out where to go, and then charging ahead on his faithful steed. And that notion of leadership is, I think, part of what contributed to the Australian population's general dis-ease with having a woman as the Prime Minister. While many of us celebrated it, the level of misogyny that she endured, and Dr. Summers wrote an article about it, which was really breathtaking. It goes to that notion of how we culturally understand leadership and whether or not, you know, a girl is doing it or a boy is doing it or somebody who floats between is doing it. The other thing that I wanted to reflect on was quotas as a strategy. So the YWCA has a quota to support the participation of women under the age of 31 on our boards. So the board that I report to has 30% of its membership at minimum being women under the age of 31. And if you look at the ALP, a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago now, they introduced quotas to increase the number of women who were being elected to Parliament. Now, as always, the question about quotas has to be understood in two ways. One, you've actually got to look at the results, not just the opportunity. So it's not enough that you are pre-selecting a bunch of women to seats if they're all safe Liberal seats and you're from the ALP. You've actually got to be pre-selecting women to winnable seats. And I think when you look at the fact that the previous cabinet under the Gillard and Rudd governments had a higher proportion of women in cabinet than we've seen in our history, you can see the impact of quotas as pipelines for the participation of women in leadership. But it's more than that. We have to look at the culture of the organisations and engage in cultural transformation programs, because what we're trying to do is challenge those dominant ideas of what leadership is, a bloke on a horse leading from the front, to alternative conceptualisations which, A, help men deconstruct what can be incredibly harmful and limiting gender stereotypes on them, and B, help leadership deconstruct to value traits and characteristics and ways of being that are commonly associated with women. Now, in my view, I'm pretty sure that my brother can care for his daughters just as effectively as his wife. They might do it slightly differently, but the notions, the ideas of gender that we ascribe to people, we've been taught from a very, very little age, and we can change them if we engage with them critically. So some of the cultural transformation programs that we're looking at the YWCA, which I just adore, are the Diploma of Leadership and Women's Leadership, which the YWCA of Canberra and Queensland and Victoria and Adelaide, sorry Carolyn, are looking at running next year, starting in September this year, but also the Women Out Front program. And what these programs do is not only do they encourage us to, as women, learn more about the leadership skills that we want, learn more about our values and identities as leaders, but they also contribute to us challenging and transforming the culture of the organisations that we are operating in, and transforming the notion of leadership so that it embraces emotional intelligence. It embraces and acknowledges that as much as you need strength, you need vulnerability. And it embraces and encourages a range of women and men to challenge and transform the gender norms around caring so that women and men care for their children equally. And I just wanted to finish with talking about Every Girl, which is another cultural transformation program that the YWCA has run, because what Every Girl does is work with 9 and 10-year-old girls and encourage them to see themselves as leaders in their families, in their homes, in their communities, to start thinking about things like mindfulness and values and your identity. But more than anything, it also encourages them to see that they can be active agents for change in their communities, because every girl does a community change program. And we know that if, as a 9 or 10-year-old, you get that sense that, of course, I can change what's happening. And I love it. The very first Every Girl pilot that rang, it was just after the Four Corners show had been broadcast on the live animal export trade, and our Every Girls thought that what they'd like to do was end the live animal export trade from Australia as their community change project. So dream big, challenge your notions of leadership, and I think that's really key.
Thanks, Cara.
I'll acknowledge. Can people hear? Yeah, it's working. Certainly agree that this is a long game. I got a little bit depressed, sorry, about how far back we went. But we're not going to have a pack a ginjal moment because I disagree on that at all. But I suppose as you were talking, I certainly remembered back sort of in the 80s, and I moved to Canberra from Queensland, so, you know, I knew what being left out of the loop was all about. And the debate was live and well, and I thought we made great gains back then, you know, and I sort of took my eye off it for a while. And I was working in largely female-dominated departments and working for great women and all this sort of stuff, a few blokes along the way. They weren't too bad either. And I thought it was all sorted. And then you actually start to see it slipping back. So whilst the question goes to what are the high moments, and I do think all of the things you cited that YWCA is pushing are fundamental and instrumental, there are moments. There are the fact that we are talking about this, and I don't know how many women's conferences I've spoken at, or that's the theme in the last 3 years, but the 10 years before that we weren't talking about it. So it's got to be ever present and talked about constantly. The other things that I think are really, you know, from as I scan the landscape, the work that, you know, Liz Broderick as Sex Discrimination Commissioner and her Male Champions of Change, really getting those big power brokers to think about themselves. And, you know, I haven't made contact with all of them, but the ones who are doing things are really making a difference. So men are actually a fundamental piece of the solution. They've cracked the code. And as we start to, you know, make this conversation real for them, that is key to the sort of solutions. And as you quite rightly point out, you know, modern workplaces, there are young men with kids who have the same issues and aspirations. They're still not bearing the burden that women do, but as it becomes a normalised conversation, I'm quite hopeful that there is real opportunity for change. There are some places that are starting a little bit further behind the 8 ball than others, for instance. But you know, I think, and my probably comment mainly from a government sense, but, you know, there were no women in the SES before 1975 or whenever it was. It was, you know, a relatively new institution, 4% back in the 80s. Now it's up to 37%. That's still not good enough, but you can see what can be done. And there were, at the time, not things as quotas as such, but there were goals and targets. But that whole measurement, constantly ensuring that this is a live debate, I think is absolutely fundamental to success around this.
Carmel, do you think in that time that you're observing that notions of leadership have changed? I mean, one of the questions for you was, when we think about traditional notions of leadership, as Caro's mentioned, they're often associated with quite masculine values. Do you think that's shifted? Do you think it needs to shift more? How can we open up the idea of leadership to a broader array of values?
I think it's deeply culturally set. That there are many people, I've forgotten what survey it was that I read a few weeks ago, that, you know, as you're heading into a financial crisis, and this is a question asked of men and women, who would you actually select to assist you? You know, men and women picked the bloke, even though they knew that the woman was had the skills. So it's deep. But that doesn't mean it can't change, and it isn't changing. But I think you can't be what you can't see, so we need to actually have women as role models who actually espouse and live that journey, and we actually, publish the success. Women as leaders are different. Their style is different, and that's what's powerful about having women and people who think and differently and are from different cultural backgrounds to be at the table, so that the discussion and the outcomes are much richer. We know that. We know, when I went to Defence, I would run meetings, and when I started to speak, they'd all pick up their pens as if, because I'm the most senior, therefore I'm the wisest. Bit odd that she's a girl, but they wrote down everything I said, and I said, well, just stop that. I want to have a conversation. And they just weren't used to that. So it's a different way. Women do want to have a collaborative approach. I mean, there's plenty on that. That's just not my assertion. And that's how modern, complex problems are solved, not through the sort of authoritative, hierarchical, command control. So women bring that to the table. And I think, part of what you were asking me in this question too was what's the advice to young women on the way through? I mean, there are times when you see a certain style, and it's, as Catherine Fox would say, pale, male and stale, and you sort of think, well, I don't really want to be that, but if I don't act and behave like them, I won't be treated seriously. Well, my first bit of advice is, well, get over that. Be yourself. Be authentic. That's the most important thing for women as leaders. And observe those people that you really admire and who my best CEO of all time, Sue Varden, the things I learnt just from watching how she dealt with issues, and as a very charismatic, powerful leader, irrespective of gender, but she brought something different. And I learnt so much from her as a role model, as someone to follow, someone who I watched fail as well. But, you learn from those sorts of opportunities.
Thanks, Carmel. Helen, women still are more likely to be primary carers than men. Women with dependent children are significantly more likely to be out of the workforce than men. What are the barriers in the current workforce structure that limit the ability of mothers and carers to participate, and what would a more inclusive workplace look like?
Well, it's a really good question, and I don't think we should underestimate the difficulty of the task. And often I meet young women who say, look, thank God for those old feminists, they cracked that nut. Well, actually, I hate to say the old feminists didn't crack the nut. We still have a problem, and a lot of young women, when they join the workforce, don't see any difficulty initially, and it isn't until there's a trigger point like you're becoming pregnant, having some family issues that you need to deal with, when it becomes very obvious we're a long way off gender equality. And of course, if we look at the power base in workplaces, it's mostly held by men. And there's great power in incumbency. People don't want to give up that position. And there's, inbuilt resistance to change and inertia in the status quo. So you need something that's going to disrupt that to make the change. So there's quite a big task, and it's not just organisations we're asking to make changes. I think all shoulders to the wheel here. We need young women as well doing what they can and not underestimating the task ahead of all of us. But more particularly to the question, I don't think there's any doubt really that the biggest reason, the most significant reason why we haven't got equality in workplaces is that employers have failed to embrace flexibility. When I talk about flexibility, I don't talk about part-time work. I talk about a broad range of flexible work options for both men and women, but also flexible careers. And by flexible careers, I mean the ability to move in and out of the workforce without disadvantage to promotion and the advancement of your career, whether you're a man or a woman. Now, commonly we know that flexible work options are most required at this point by women because we still bear the greatest responsibility in caring, and I think, as comments have been previously made, we need to even up that burden between men and women. We need to have much more equal sharing of the paid and the unpaid work. So commonly what we see in workplaces is, women getting offered some pretty poor quality part-time work, and employers think they're offering flexible work. And they're not. They don't understand flexible work, and actually they don't understand the business case for flexible work. Only a year or so ago, EY issued a report, and what they found was that female flexible workers, primarily part-time, but there were casual and contractors in that pool, were the most productive workers in Australia. There is a business case for part-time work, for flexible work. When I was in the private sector, for many years, had incredible productivity out of the most extraordinary range of flexible work practices that were in my division, and most particularly among my managers. So I'm a great devotee of flexible work because I do believe it leads to great productivity and loyalty. But it really means changing the paradigm. As I say, most workers really struggle to get part-time work, and often poor quality part-time work, because employers don't really understand changing the paradigm here. We do need to think much more broadly and act much more expansively. And a very good example of that is Telstra. Now, Telstra, a large organisation, so this is pretty challenging for them, they've declared all roles can be done flexibly. And so the onus of proof is reversed. So the opening position, the starting position is all roles are flexible. You tell me why they can't be done flexibly. Now, they're having some pretty challenging discussions in their various business units at the moment about how to operationalise that. But the key to it is strong leadership from David Thodey, the CEO, who says, I'm going to enforce this. And although they're a large organisation, they also have some small businesses. They have those little Telstra shops, which are actually small businesses. So they're trying to implement this in a large organisation that also has the manifestation of small business. So I think it's all about flexible work, and I recognise that this is a big task, and people really, and employers in particular, are struggling to understand the full value of this. But in truth, until we embrace this fully, we're not going to have true equality in workplaces. And really, it's all about, and this is part and parcel of it, when women say, look, I'm pregnant, I need to go off on leave, you need to start the conversation then with, well, now what do you want to do? Do you want to come back? When do you want to come back? What's the sort of job you'd like to come back to? And do the planning early. And women have a responsibility here to be proactive as well. You just can't sit back and wait for the employer to do it, particularly if your manager's a male who's not terribly switched on. So, you need to start these conversations. And then when people are on leave, there are very innovative things some employers are doing about stay in touch. I can think of programs where, women on leave, on parental leave, come back for particular meetings, and the employers will pay for the childcare while that's happening. So those stay in touch things are so important. And when somebody comes back, helping them back into the situation, because look, workplaces change dramatically in 12 months. I mean, systems changes, things like that. So a buddy system or something like that to help you get back into the workplace, and give people jobs that don't underemploy them. You put all this money into education of women. Why wouldn't you want to get the best benefit? But we see many women underemployed. They could do a lot more than they're being offered in the roles they get when they come back. So I think it's all about that flexible work aspect, but importantly too, to have a more inclusive workplace, we really do need to deal with the biases. There are conscious biases, there are unconscious biases. There are a whole lot of stereotypes about what work women should do or should not do. There are a whole lot of assumptions about what managers should look like in particular roles. We don't give women those big profit and loss roles because really that's men's business. So all these weird assumptions that are made. So we need to challenge that. We need to get rid of these biases. I mean, people talk a lot about unconscious bias, but there is frankly a lot of conscious bias. I mean, there are some people who just make outrageous statements like, I'll never have a woman in my boardroom. Well, no amount of my talking to that dinosaur is going to change his mind. I mean, he'll cycle off and, the ordinary processes of life will take care of him. But, so you do have to focus on those where you think you can make a bit of change. But I think it's important to challenge these things in the workplace. And incredibly, what you see in HR infrastructure in organisations is embedded bias, and quite often unconscious. And it isn't until you unpick the individual HR systems that you'll find those embedded biases. So, look, there's much work ahead, but they're the sorts of things I think that we need to be focusing on and get into the practicality of this. We don't need to do any more research. People keep doing research. I keep telling them to stop doing it. It's a waste of time and money. Let's put our focus on the effort in workplaces.
Thank you very much, Helen. Can I follow up at the flip side? There's clearly and unambiguously a role for government in promoting the kind of workplace flexibility, or indeed legislating greater workplace flexibility. Politicians seem extremely reluctant, and perhaps rightly, to enter into the domain of the domestic distribution of labour, which is one of the points that you've made, is that until we get a more equal sharing of caring responsibilities, we won't see the kind of change that's going to be essential for women to achieve across these areas of leadership. So, for all of the panellists, what's the answer there? Caro?
I have views on this. First of all, I wanted to say that internationally we have a legal obligation under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. It says that governments have a responsibility to take steps to transform harmful cultural stereotypes. So we signed on, the Australian government signed on to CEDAW, and so we actually do have an international legal basis for the Australian government putting in place legislative and cultural change programs that would encourage and enable women and men and those who float between to reconsider and reconstruct the gender care arrangements within their own families. And one of the great things about the paid parental leave schemes that we've got both under the ALP and with the Liberal Party government is that it is available to men and women. And that's a really important thing, because if it was just attached to a mother, then we would be reinforcing those stereotypes. So I think the fact that it's available to mothers and fathers, that the current proposal from the Liberal Party is that it be wage replacement. We don't take annual leave at the minimum wage, we take annual leave at our replacement wage. So that's a really important factor for women's economic security going forward. But also that we can talk about the Australian government having a role in cultural change campaigns. You know, we've seen health organisations promote cultural change around exercise. When I was growing up, there was, you know, the Slip Slop Cam campaign, and, you know, there was the Don't Be a Litterbug campaign. We know that if we have cute little cartoon characters, we're going to get some cultural buy-in from Australians. So let's, you know, what sort of things can we be doing? Because it is about, not only do you see the role models, but you are encouraged to understand that there is another way possible. And I think that the Australian government, as much as the Australian community, have a responsibility to show leadership.
Well, considering what we've been seeing with this government, I don't know if we can rely on them to do anything for women, let alone our children. So I'm going to take a different stand on this and say that we as women need to take responsibility for ourselves. We've seen laws change, we've seen protests, and at the end of the day, as we've heard from other women and from Anne Summers this morning and for the last 130 years, yes, we are equal, but we're not treated equally. So when I say we have to start taking responsibility, before you get married, before you say yes, make sure you have that conversation. Is he going to be willing to stay home and look after the children while you have a career? If you've already married him and he doesn't play nice, throw him out. Get a new one. No, I'm being serious. Like, you know, this is... We blame our governments and we blame our systems, but at the end of the day, we're the ones that are procreating. We're the ones that are going to have the joys and the negatives of bringing up children, and at the same time, we need to make those serious decisions. Now, as far as changing the culture of our system, if we go back to how it how it all originated, we have to remember that these corporations and these systems were built by men, for men, with only the needs of men in mind. At lunchtime, I was sitting next to one of the speakers from the first panel. She had her breast out feeding her child, and she was telling me about how she got kicked out of a restaurant the other day for breastfeeding her child. And I said to her, well, it doesn't really surprise me in Australia, but at the same time, where, in what building, apart from the airport, I've never seen a room for women to breastfeed their child. So you can't do it in public, but there's no buildings. You know, what Deloitte or ANZ Bank or any other corporation has a room for breastfeeding? So if we're going to play with these boys, we either make the decision to play their game and not breastfeed, and wear the padded shoulders like we used to in the 80s, thinking that we could walk into the boardroom and be one of them. I remember I shaved my head and put on the pads and thought I could be one of the boys. It doesn't work. So what I'm seeing, and we're seeing it not only in Australia but around the world, is that women are saying, you know what, I'm done with the system. I now have the education, I now have the technology, and I have the know-how. Screw you, I'm going to start my own business. And I'm going to be as flexible or as non-flexible as possible. I know women that work from midnight to 4 o'clock in the morning. On Skype, they have clients in other parts of the world. That's their choice. If any of you here are thinking of starting a business, don't do it until you talk to me. However, because there's negatives as well. However, there are choices, and we're now seeing an extraordinary amount of women making those choices because the systems that are in place have failed us, like Helen mentioned. So we now have a lot more choices. Now, one of the things that continues, even when you start your own business, which was also mentioned, was the discrimination. The Australian Women's Chamber of Commerce, who I'm with, we did the first research project in Australia about female entrepreneurs, because lo and behold, 1 million women just don't count in this country. So that research showed us that a lot of the issues that are taking place in the corporate environment are also overlapping, even when it comes to you running your own business. So women are still being discriminated on or against. And that includes a whole variety of issues, whether you're pregnant or whether you're a mother, or whether you're trying to get in with the boys at the same time. The other day I was at a conference and I asked one of the other speakers about their policy, their diversity policy within their supply chain. He didn't have a clue what I was talking about. Women, supply chain? I said, yeah, you know, when you need to buy your sandwiches, do you look for a woman? Or when you need a lawyer, do you look for a female lawyer? Or when you need some product or service, do you think about including women? There's a million of them out there. He was a CEO of a very large company. He had no idea. He hadn't even thought about it. So I think when it comes to the term diversity, which we've been talking a lot about over the last 3 years, as Carmel pointed out, we need to stop thinking just about one sector. You know, the women on boards is a very important issue, but we've been talking about that for 10 years and we still haven't been heard. We're talking about getting women from lower management into leadership roles, but we also have to remember that there's 1 million women out there that need to be included. And you, as women, have more power than you realise. You have the power of the purse. You are the biggest consumers on planet Earth. You buy everything. Stop buying from David Jones if you know that they're screwing their employees. Start buying from women. There are women selling everything that you possibly need. Every service and every product you can buy a woman. So when we talk about diversity, think outside the square and remember that you already have a lot of power. You just need to start using it.
Yolanda, can I ask you just to take us out of the city for the moment and into rural and regional Australia and just comment a little about entrepreneurialism in regional and remote communities and the work that your organisation does with those women?
Well, it's interesting to note that there's actually now more women in regional rural Australia than there are men that run their own business. And some of those issues are obvious. They can't get access to the jobs that they require, or they can't get access to the education that they need. So a lot of them do it entrepreneurship by necessity, others by choice. But what is interesting is that the women in rural and regional Australia have the same issues that the women in metro Australia have. And some of those issues include childcare and or paying themselves an adequate market wage, paying themselves superannuation, being able to find contracts, being able to obtain connections and networks in order to get into supply chains. So the similarities across the board are very similar. What is interesting, as I started off by saying, is that there are now more women in regional rural Australia than there are men. But what's even more interesting across the board is that there are now more women than men in Australia running a business between the ages of 35 and 44. I wonder if they're the childbearing years.
Interesting. So I want to ask all of the panellists just to give us a final reflection before we throw over to the floor about what your recommendation is for fulfilling one's leadership ambitions despite the kinds of barriers that we've been talking about. What's the one tip or piece of personal advice that you'd give?
For me, it's about understanding what the values are that drive you and being clear on them and being open to them not fitting a norm. I was saying in the session before lunch when I did an exercise a couple of years ago about what are my values. You know, I've been a card-carrying feminist since I was knee-high, and I thought, well, feminism would be one of them. And it wasn't. And it was things like joy and whimsy. Equality was there, integrity. But I was like, but joy's not a leadership characteristic. It is. Being able to lead through passion, integrity, and bringing a sense of joy to the work that you do, particularly when you work on gender equality, which, you know, as Carmel was saying, we've been going backwards. And when you hear the stories of girls being married at the age of 9 to 70-year-olds, you want to cry. And you do cry because it's evil and hateful, and that is a life ruined. Having a space for something like joy and whimsy as part of your leadership is really important. So understand your values.
I think a few words of wisdom would be when you start out, I often see a number of women who have a lot of plans, and that closes off opportunity sometimes. So I think it's good to have an idea and follow what you want to and what excites you and what you're good at. But jobs and the labour market change so much that jobs that you'll be doing in 10 years don't exist now, all of that. So don't lock it out. Drive your own growth. You are responsible for your own growth as well as if you are with your employer. So stay ahead of issues. Think big and do diverse and broad things. Challenge yourself out of your comfort zone. See what you like. It's something that you're not particularly good at. And I've learnt more from failure than I have on when things have been going really well. Look out for the good people to work for and observe them and grow that in yourself if you think that's something you like. Be curious, be authentic, work hard. When someone says, we're looking for someone to do this, don't think about, oh my God, it'll take me an hour and a half to drive home or whatever. Put your hand up and work it out later. The blokes will. The women do it when they're 70% ready. The blokes, no, other way around. Blokes do it when they're about 10% ready, and women have to be 110% before they will. And that's the way of building confidence. And look out for one another. Build networks. Networks have been critical to my survival, and that has been both men and women, but particularly women who are going through the issues you're going through. There's a lot that can be learned from the sharing and looking out for one another. And as you climb the greasy pole, those professional networks will be very important in helping you go further. And that goes to the issue of mentoring and sponsors. And I've do talk a bit about mentoring, where you've got to be careful about that because you don't want a contrived environment or a contrived relationship. It's something that's got to work for you. But also, mentors then need to step up and help you open the window and help you climb through, and then your responsibility is to look out for who's coming behind. So I could go on forever, but that's enough for me.
Look, I absolutely agree with all that. I'll just add a couple of other things. I think it's really important that you understand your value and that you're able to articulate very clearly what your value proposition is. It doesn't matter what organisation you're in. It's sort of the 30-second elevator speech. You know, why are you a compelling proposition for somebody? And often when you ask people that question, they stumble. So it's something that's worth spending a bit of time on and practicing in front of that mirror, because when you're looking for opportunities, talking to people, if you can articulate your value clearly, it's incredibly powerful. A couple of other things: absolutely develop those skills you need to be a good leader. We all go to university, we get technical skills. I went and studied law, but that did not equip me for management and leadership positions. So you need to develop those skills, the negotiating skills, the influencing skills that you need. So you need this mindset of continuous education. Courses and conferences like this are so valuable. I think the other really important thing is, I agree with Carmel, seize those opportunities when they arise, because they may never come again. But sometimes it's tough, and you really do need to be pretty robust and resilient. And I've worked in male-dominated environments most of my life, and I found this to be very important. You will face really tough times. You'll grab something and say, I'm going to do it, and then, 3 months later, it's really hard. And people are making it really hard for you, and sometimes men make it really hard for you. But you have to be robust and resilient. Those potential moments of derailment happen to everybody. So it's really important to stay the course, be robust and resilient. And I remember sitting in many meetings as often the only female director in a boardroom or the only female executive on an executive team. You'd spend a day in a meeting, you'd get to about 3 o'clock and you think, can I listen to this bullshit anymore, They just go round and round and round. And, I've said something at 9:30 and then Jack says it at 3:30 and they think it's a huge revelation. And so you think, so you just feel very tired and you feel quite, disillusioned. But my view about all that is get home, have a glass of red wine, and the next day you'll feel well and truly equipped to go back into the fray.
Do you want anything, Yolanda? That's great.
Here, Helen. I totally agree with both Carmel and Helen, and with Helen and I have had a few of those conversations about if he says that one more time, I'm going to scream. But if any of you have read The Tao, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I suggest you do. It talks about being like water, and how water in a stream or in a river just flows to where it needs to go. And I know we're not water, even though we're made up of about 80% water. But the point of me saying that is, if you have a direction and you know where you want to go, don't stop and say, oh, you rock, you, get out of my way. Go under it, or over it, or around it. In order for us to get where we want to go, we need to know where we want to go. But sometimes life gets in the way and every plan that you've made becomes irrelevant, and therefore you have to change your plans. But nevertheless, if the water needs to go up the hill or around the rock or over the tree, it does that until it gets to its final point. And I think it's really important for us, especially as women, not only as humans but also as women, we need to be true to ourselves. And if leadership is in fashion right now, but you have no inclination, then go against fashion. Don't go against the tide, because you're going against your own soul and your own heart. And regardless of how hard you fight the wind and the rock and the tree, if your soul's not in it, you're never going to get there. So really believe in what you want to do, irrelevant of the fashions or what degree you have or what your parents or your husband or your lover or anybody else tells you. And with that, you need a lot of courage and you need to have a lot of faith in yourself, which is what Helen was commenting on. And I remember as a kid, I was the boy of the family. And apparently, according to the Australian Financial Review back in the 80s, I got this particular job because I had balls. Last time I checked, I had ovaries, but... And the point of me saying that is that if you believe it, others will believe it as well. And that's why the blokes that Carmel pointed to, they go, oh yeah, I can do that. 10%, you know. There's a study that shows that if a man can tick off 2 of the selection criteria for the job, he'll apply for it. 2. Women, if they don't tick minimum 8 or 9, they don't even think about it. That's ludicrous. And as Carmel said, you have to put your hand up. Go with the water. You know where you want to get to. Just follow it. Go down there. And my last piece of advice is stay away from the queen bees, because you will encounter them. They'll try to sting you. They'll try and knock the ladder out from under you. Not because you're not better than them, exactly the opposite. It's usually because you are better than them, they fear you. And fear is a very strange phenomenon in human nature. And the last one is, remember that no is negotiable. And I can tell you hundreds of Tories where I've been told no. No, you can't go to university, you're a wog and you're a woman, they'll never let you in. No, you can't start a women's chamber, women don't need a chamber. No, you can't speak a different language because in Australia, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I've heard it so many times. If I'd listened to it, I'd be dead somewhere, you know, at the age of 11, I think. So remember, no is negotiable, and just like water, be like water. Thank you.
Now's your opportunity to seek some advice, ask some questions, get to the solution. Here at the front first, thanks.
I have a question for Helen. My first job was at the University of Adelaide writing EOWA reports at early 2000s, and it really shaped my understanding of equality for women in the workplace. This session's called From Statistics to Solutions, and Anne Summers said it nicely this morning when she said what gets measured gets noticed. What happens for the Workforce Gender Equality Agency if government doesn't want that measurement anymore? Those statistics that you see, gender pay gap, or any of those statistics that come out of your agency, what happens if that's not there anymore?
Well, look, it's a really good question, because the legislation which was changed about 18 months ago means that our agency will get output data. So we'll actually get, instead of input, people used to report to us on their programs to improve the lot of women in workplaces. Now they'll report against items described as gender equality indicators. So we'll get a whole lot of quantitative data. So the gender equality indicators are those things identified as being the key impediments to gender equality in Australian workplaces. So we'll get this data. It's absolutely world-leading data. It's groundbreaking. It will give us an unprecedented picture of gender equality in Australian workplaces. And the key is it's standardised. So it's a broad base of data, so it's all organisations in the private sector with 100 or more employees must report to us. So it's broad-based. It is company and organisation specific. It's standardised because the data is provided in standardised categories. And it is across those key areas of gender inequality as we see them today. And we'll get that data and we'll provide to each reporting organisation a confidential, customised benchmark report. So they'll be able to say what groups they want to be compared against, and they'll get this confidential report. So it's an evidence base for them. It's a business intelligence tool, basically. They can see where they're at, where they're doing well, where they're not doing so well, where they can focus their efforts, and they can check their performance against their competitors, and they can track their progress over time. So this is incredibly powerful. It's the engine room of the legislation. It gives all organisations who report to us the evidence base to improve their gender performance. And this is what they've been complaining about. They say they don't have this data, so we're going to give them the data. And of course we'll then aggregate the data, and so on our interactive data centre on our website we'll have available all the aggregated data which can be interrogated by anybody at large. So we believe this is truly the thing that will move the needle. But it does depend on this framework which is set out in the Workplace Gender Equality Act continuing. Now, to get to the nub of your question, I suppose the issue is, to what extent does this government see that as valuable? The Commission of Audit has recommended that my agency be folded back into the Department of Employment. So the agency would cease to exist as an independent statutory agency if that was to be adopted by the government. And the problem there is that, you know, we would have probably a lost opportunity to strongly advocate for gender equality in Australian workplaces. The data could still be collected by the Department of Employment, of course, but there's a power in having an independent agency, and I'm under the Act, the Director of Workplace Gender Equality, quite a daunting title actually. I'm a long way off achieving that objective. Sometimes I feel quite a failure at night as I put my head on my pillow. But, you know, it gives me the imprimatur and indeed the accountability to be out there advocating for gender equality in Australian workplaces, and I think that's very difficult if you fold us into the department. So that's simply a recommendation from the Commission of Audit. I have no idea what the government's view of that is. And look, it's true to say we're also a regulator, so the government currently has a very strong deregulation agenda. We all have to hand up some, you know, reduced regulation. So I think it's fair to say the appetite for regulation of our nature may be reducing. However, having said that, when there was some suggestion that the regulation or the reporting to the agency might be diminished back in February this year, there was an extraordinary outcry, most particularly from the women's groups, and that, frankly, led the government to change its mind. So as I look at all you in the room, we're just about to go into the Minister's just about to start another consultation in relation to our agency. We are the most consulted upon agency forever, and we're only 33 people. And we only cost this government $5 million a year. We live off the smell of an oily rag. Now, so they're about to consult again for 6 months, an exhausting process. So we don't know what the outcome of that will be, but hopefully if it looks like there might be some erosion in the value of this data and the collection of this data, there'll be very noisy people out there who will help our cause and hopefully persuade those in power that actually the data really does matter.
And I was just going to say that the YWCA is part of the Coalition for Working Women, which has, and so you're mob, aren't you? Has part of its agenda to defend the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and there's a mob of us going into the Treasurer's stakeholder lockup for the federal budget tonight. Yolanda and I will be leaving, sadly, the conference at 3:05 to go, and I'm really delighted. I've been going into lockup for a few years now. We've got a really kick-ass feminist analysis team in budget lockup this year, and I think that our capacity to run a gender analysis across a range of social policy and economic issues will be really quite considerable. And certainly we've got one of our dot points is to see what's the Commission of Audit recommendation on YWCA is, and to include that in our analysis and press release tonight.
I just wanted to refer to your question. We don't know what's going to happen with YWCA, but in relation to what happens with this data, unfortunately Australia stopped collecting data about entrepreneurs back in 2011. So as a consequence of that, because we don't have the macro data, Australia has been excluded from the OECD report. We've been excluded from the Global Entrepreneurial Monitoring Report, GEM, and because we don't have this data, the world obviously just ignores us. So according to the world data, Australia doesn't have any entrepreneurs, let alone sex-segregated data on entrepreneurs. One of the consequences from that, as we've now seen last year when the COAG report about women and girls was written in Australia, female entrepreneurs and female employers were excluded. So if you look at the COAG report, there's no such thing as females in Australia that own a company or employ anybody. So that's some of the consequences of not collecting data, and there's no sign in this government at the moment that we're going to start collecting any data on businesses in Australia. And I'm privileged to sit on the Ministerial Advisory Committee, and again I've been bringing this up now for 4 years, and it goes in one ear and out the other because they don't want to know. That's the reality.
there was a question up the back and then a couple more here and one up the back there too. So is somebody at the back here earlier?
I'm very excited over there.
Yes, I know. I've got to let Khadija ask her question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about assumptions, which I know that you have touched on. Caroline, we did talk a little bit about at lunch as well. We always talk about the assumptions that are made about women and also, as you mentioned, the type of leader that we believe should be leading, basically. I want to ask about the assumptions that we're making about men and what we women can actually do to challenge those assumptions, because it seems like, you know, we're never going to get anywhere with flexible work unless we can mainstream flexible work and make it okay for men to request to work flexibly and to take on the bulk of the childcare duties as well.
Yeah, sure. The assumptions that we make, particularly around care, are harmful to all of us. You know, this assumption that my brother can't look after his little girls, and it's not like his wife thinks he can, but this general broad-based idea within society that women are naturally caregiving and men don't have that within them is so intrinsically damaging to not only women but also men. And when you think about the continuum, I love the word continuum, the continuum of gender and how we understand ideas of gender, the idea that men are somehow less caring is so intrinsically damaging, not only in terms of how men operate within their families, but also the idea of what it perpetuates in terms of ideas of violence, what it perpetuates in terms of our norms of leadership. And so I really think that if what we can do is reframe, be far more open. You know, when someone says to you something which has a gender assumption in it, catch it. Ask yourself, does that really exist? Or is it just because I grew up watching, you know, in my family, I grew up watching my dad write the cheques and my mum didn't write the cheques. So what did that teach me about financial responsibility, and what do I need to unpick in my own life? Look back, excavate your families. Look and see where the gender roles were, and then catch them as they come out in your own behaviour, in how you treat people around you, in how you raise your children or the kids in your life, and catch yourself and unpack them. Because I think that this idea, if you look at the statistics, the group of workers in our community that work the longest hours are men in that so-called reproductive age group. Another indicator for us in Australia is we are continuing to have a conversation about working mothers. Pretty sure it takes two to tango, or there are other ways around it as well. But you know, working fathers, working mothers, working parents. So long as we continue to talk about working mothers as our primary way into this debate, so long as we talk about parental leave being primarily about girls, so long as we talk about flexible return to work being for a woman who's pregnant and not for a man who's just had children, then we are not going to be unpacking all of these gendered assumptions. And so, yeah, go excavate your family. It's a rich and fertile field, I've found.
Could I just go in a different direction? The assumption, I mean, this conference is about she leads. There's a massive assumption, this is a massive statement too, that women don't want to lead, that they aren't cut out for it. Now, that is a grand statement because I have an evolved husband, an evolved son, and I've worked with those sort of evolved types. I've also worked with some down this end of the spectrum, and they have said that to me. They have said to me when I have shown them the pink and blue staffing profiles, that pink goes down the more senior you are, and they say, what's the problem? And I said, I thought you were reasonably bright, I thought that you could see, and there's no problem. They don't want to lead. And I say, so they don't want the big bucks either? No, apparently, but it's just an old sort of statement, old-fashioned, and in industries where you're not welcome, we don't need you, life's been fine, we'll just continue. So that is a massive sort of unconscious and sometimes conscious down this level of the continuum that women don't want to lead. Now that's really the essence of what has to be challenged, because women do, women can, women should, and when they are leading, they're bloody good at it.
Thank you. I'm really sorry to say that we need to get you to your workshop. So I know there were people who had questions, we haven't been able to reach you. Over afternoon tea, perhaps, you might get a chance to speak with those of the panel who are still here. The next thing we need you to do is join me in thanking our magnificent panellists and expressing